Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back to By Design. I'm Pronago, and this is my solo podcast. This episode of By Design is actually about a design tenant, unlike the first inaugural episode, which was about BlizzCon. Perfect. So, on this second episode of By Design, I wanted to talk about design overhead. It's something that I've become intimately familiar with over the past couple of months, and I think it's something that has always plagued my projects in one way or another. It's just that as I became a more competent developer, the manifestations of that overhead problem kind of changed and morphed and surprised me every single time. And so there's actually three different kinds of overhead that I have witnessed and been affected by, at least personally, when it comes to designing my own projects. The first kind is probably the one that trips people up the most when they're starting out and when they're still developing their skills. And that is the idea of, I really have this epic idea for a project, but I can't personally make it happen. And as a result of my own inability to make whatever I want to make happen reality, I now have an overhead issue. So you're going to get into a position where a lot of what you want to do can't be accomplished either. Maybe it isn't necessarily your own incapability, your lack of expertise. Could also be the fact that, the engine you're working within is not suited for whatever you're trying to do. That happens all the time. And you don't have the personal means to, reverse engineer the project, reverse engineer the base engine, and make it compatible with the kind of mechanic or system or whatever design element you're trying to implement. And so that also can happen. But that's sort of like an extension of the same thing. In a way, the other kinds of design overhead that I've seen feed back into this. So the second one, and that's the one that I've been dealing with the most, is certainly about, when you can theoretically achieve what you want to achieve, it's no longer about your own personal skills that are now drawn into question. It's more so that you require the assistance of other individuals in order to make your project a reality. It's not that these individuals will support you with some supportive supplementary content that will augment your final experience. It's that these individuals and their skill sets are necessary in order for your project to even be possible. And without them, some massive refactoring would have to take place if your project was going to get off the ground and into somebody else's hard drive. And so this is probably a bit more nefarious just because of the fact that you can't always rely on people, especially in hobby scenes like modding. And I've been very blessed, and I am very grateful for the people that I have surrounded myself with, in the past couple of years, 1 to 2 years, because very few of them have flaked and voided and just disappeared. And when people said that they were good for testing, or DF does a lot of the art for me, and iQuare has done plugin work, Nave has done plugin work, these people tend to be pretty reliable, regardless of what their role is. And to some degree, my projects would certainly suffer from not having DF's icon art or any of the other kinds of art he does, like wireframes and such. And they would certainly suffer from not having testing from Connor and DF himself and any of these other individuals that you'll see on my server. But I could still make do without it. Maybe I could make some lower quality icon art than what DF is capable of doing, since he's been drawing and in the art sphere for a lot longer than I have. And so, of course, his skills are much higher than mine. And maybe I'm not as good of a player as Connor, so I can't test to the same degree of competency. I can't test my own maps to the same degree of competency, so maybe balance will be off for a better player than my own caliber. So maybe I don't do as good a job of testing, but I can still test, and I could still theoretically do the art required for a project. And so that is not necessarily the same thing as overhead. It's more so like stretching my skill sets to the edge of their competency. And that's more reasonable. I mean, that's kind of something you want to do anyways, because you want to be able to get better at this stuff. It's more so just an issue of, does it make sense for me to spend time on that? And that's like its own question. It's not really an overhead problem that we would consider for the purpose of this kind of discussion. However, if you need these people in order for your project to happen at all, like if you're relying on art assets for a new project, like a new tech tree or something like that. Or if what's happened more recently is with Project Hydra's remake, I'm actually relying on iQuare and some of the other developers in the space to come up with a brand new data structure so that I can have infinite data arrays or data entries. And that means that like an insane amount of reverse engineering and coding has to happen in order for that to be a reality for StarCraft. That's getting around one of the core limitations of the game. And so that's like a much more like difficult thing, because there's really no way that I can, with the current amount of time that I have, work on both the production of a project and learning how to reverse engineer, and then actually doing that reverse engineering, learning how to code, and then actually doing that code. Like producing the maps and writing the scripts and doing some of the preliminary testing and, you know, doing voice acting and music and all of the other hats that I already wear. I mean, my head's already full of hats. I don't have any more space on my, you know, my forehead or anything like that. I can't like put a hat on my ass or anything. I'm not that flexible. So I have to keep this a little bit more reasonable than, you know, a jack of all trades might be able to, in the sense of I can do a little coding, and I can do a little programming, and a little bit of reverse engineering. And, you know, there's these skills that I have not yet been able to cultivate. I may never be able to cultivate, just based on the fact that I have to wear so many other hats. Like I said, right? I got to write the story, and I got to, you know, do some of a whole bunch of the production, and I got to come up with the ideas creatively, and then I got to try to express them technically. And there's all these other things that you have to do that encompass so many different things in the production phase of a project. I sort of went over this in a bit more of a minor or a minute detail, like a focused detail, in one of my other educational videos, which was the Brood War pipeline. I'll try to remember to link that in the description if you haven't already seen it or you need a refresher. So generally speaking, because there's so much stuff that I already do, there's no way that I'm really going to be able to realistically, at least in the near time, like the near future, get to the point where I can do all of the other things that I would need these other people for, like reverse engineering and doing all the art and doing all the coding, at a competent enough level to do what I need to do. And so that's where you rely on other people, and that's where the other design overhead element comes from. So those are the first two. The third one is a bit more like, I sort of coupled it together with the first one, but it's like the limitations of whatever engine you're working in. You got to try to find a way to circumvent that, and that is its own degree of overhead. And I experienced that when working with StarCraft Remastered, mostly because there's things in that project that, or in that engine rather, in that environment, that I could not do. That I could have done in 161. So it wasn't really necessarily that like it's impossible entirely. It's like you're deliberately, you know, making life harder for yourself and making it more difficult to create a quality project because of your choice of platform. That's why I invariably and inevitably went out, you know, decided to go with 161 because it's a superior platform. That's like a weird kind of overhead where you're almost opting into it, right? And you could say that you're opting into the other stuff too. You could always refactor your project and make it so that it doesn't require that overhead. And maybe that's what I'll end up doing. But I figure for the sake of the log, you know, sure, why not pop it in there? So that you got the Magic Blizzard number, 3 different examples of what an overhead looks like in a mod or a project's design philosophy, or a design phase rather. So the first one, like I said, is the one that I think most people are familiar with. Especially if they have never gone on a team, they might not be familiar with the second one. If they haven't had the luxury of choosing between multiple different platforms for their mod or their whatever other projects, then they won't maybe know about the third one as much. They won't have any experience with that one. But everybody has at some point gotten to the edge of their own competency and said, wow, if I want to do what I want to do, then I'm going to have to learn some new skills. And that in and of itself is overhead that does not directly mean that you are spending that time working on production for your project. You're spending your time doing other things, mastering your craft, improving your skills, and doing other examples that maybe you do sort of practice those skills on a project that you're working on. Like I practiced AI on Inconsummate. That was the first project that I ever worked on AI for. And, you know, it was sort of, I guess, sped run in a way where I was able to get fast-tracked by the fact that Necron was willing to help me out, and then Nave went and debugged a bunch of stuff and then made the AI script extender plugin, and now iCore is maintaining that to some degree as well. And so, sure, there's a lot of individuals that were helping me along the way, but, you know, Inconsummate was production, but also practice. And so there are times where you can be doing both at the same time, but a lot of the other times you'll be doing random experiments halfway through the production phase of a project doing something completely unrelated, just so that you can see if something is even done. You're making test maps. You're doing this stuff that isn't directly contributing to the production of a project because you want to eventually use the skills or the system that you're developing in that project. And so it does contribute to it, but it's not the same thing as if you already had those skills and you didn't have to develop them. You just had the skills right out the bat, and you could just work on using those skills to produce content for that project, right? So, get that progress bar closer to 100% and eventually you'd be done. So that's obviously an example of where that overhead can come into play. And it's not easy for everybody to just say, I'm going to start learning this new skill. As I just mentioned, maybe you already have enough skills that you feel like you're competent enough to make a project, but there are still a couple of things that you need some other people for. And that's where you would get into this consultant, contractor phase of saying, hey, can you help me out with this? Or maybe somebody volunteers for you, as has happened with me in the past. And so that's where you'll get into a point where, again, does your project rely on those other people to exist and to do what they've agreed to do for your project to exist? If so, you're experiencing that second degree of overhead. And especially if it's something where, it's a little bit different if, for example, you're UED commander, my condolences, and you are working on something like your StarCraft alternate campaign, and you say, hey, Pronago, can you make the final mission of the entire campaign? Well, me making the final mission of the entire campaign, it does have some sort of knock-on effects, like maybe you want to set up for some of the gameplay elements that I include in that. You want to experience what that's like so that you can set up the previous missions. But hopefully that just requires a little bit of modification on your end. You could theoretically make every single mission besides the one that I'm making before I even start working on the final mission. And you wouldn't really have to change those previous ones too much to reflect what I'm making, because what I'm making comes after your project. Like maybe ideally you could make an argument, okay, they all should be made around the same time and with the same design edicts and they should have all be influencing one another so that you can have the proper setup to that final mission. And to some degree, I would agree with that. But at the same time, theoretically, it doesn't necessarily involve too much of an influence on production. And so it's not really the same thing as, say, you need a new system for, your data in the case of Project Hydra, or you need some serious bug fixes for the AI script extender plugin in the case of something like Nemesis Omega. And if those things are beyond your competency and beyond your ability, then you do rely on other people to do it. And if those things are required for you to even start working on your project, seriously, then you are definitely in hot water. And that's sort of where I find Hydra and Nemesis in the current, in the current year, right? In the end of January 2019, which is when I'm recording this on the 30th of January. And it's rough, man. It's very challenging to find a way to put that all together and make that just to make that work and to keep myself motivated to work on projects when I know that realistically speaking, I could be doing so much extra work on top of what I'm saying or on top of what I'm already doing to produce the maps. Maybe I have to go back and heavily edit those maps, layout wise, AI wise, balance wise, whatever, because of some feature that didn't get added until I had the data structure in order to add that in. Something like Hydra, I'm going to make the maps and then I'm going to add the tech tree afterwards. No, the maps to some degree, and the scripts, of course, have to be balanced around those units. And maybe some dialogue events don't happen or need to be rewritten and then revoiced because they don't include mention of these new units, or they talk about tactics and that needs to be updated because of the new units or something like that. There's so many different elements of production that could be affected by something like that makes it basically impossible for me to dedicate myself to working on that project, because I know in the back of my head, could be having to do all this all over again. You never know. Maybe the changes are so radical, I have to just remake the maps entirely. And at that point, why bother making them in the first place? Why not just wait until they're, all of the parts are there so that you can assemble them once and just be done with it after you're done with that one-time assembly. That's the idea. That's what we all dream of doing. Of course, it's never usually that simple, and sometimes you just end up working on the same project for about 50 years because you can't decide if you're done with it or not. And that's sort of me with Inconsummate and me with a couple of other projects that you guys don't even know about yet because that's how long they've been in the fucking pipeline. So that's just how it goes. But maybe that's the same thing for Hydra. At the same time, I don't really know yet because of that second part of the overhead puzzle, the second example of overhead, where you're relying on other people, relying on third-party elements, right? And it's not necessarily the other people's fault either. It could just be that what you need is so out of the like ordinary and so off the deep end in terms of requests that in order to like even expect that to be done, you'd have to be waiting like half a year or something. Like maybe iQuere and Nave and whoever else is involved in creating that new data structure, maybe they won't be able to, make any reasonable headway for another few months, at which point, of course I could, again, be doing a lot of work that I then have to go back and redo. And so that's why Hydra isn't a current active project. And maybe the AI script extender plugin takes a couple months to debug. And that's why Nemesis Omega isn't an active project right now, really. Like I'm doing some casual modding streams for both of those projects here and there, but it's nothing that's super active. It's nothing that I'm working on tirelessly day in and day out. And I think that that's probably one of the main reasons why I wanted to talk about this in an episode of By Design, because I feel like it is a situation where, as a developer, I can give you examples of where I've fallen short in the idea that you want to avoid a design overhead, because you really do. You want to send that shit directly to Amon, like package it up and send it to him, because you do not want any part of this. You don't want your own competency to be called in question because your own skills aren't good enough for what you need to do. You don't want your platform working against you. You want to be on a platform, like the best platform for what you're trying to do. Like for me, that's not Unreal because I don't have the competency to speak the English language or work in Unreal, apparently. So, of course, I have to stay within StarCraft for now, but ideally, maybe I'm working towards the idea of working within Unreal or working within another game engine and being able to say, hey, after all this, I'm ready to, make my own game. And it's because of the skills I learned while modding Brood War. Okay, well, maybe that ends up happening. That's sort of like the ideal, like that's a pipe dream, but it's also like the ideal that I'm striving for when I wake up every day and start working on Brood War stuff. So there's an element of it to that. And then, you don't want the other one, which is, of course, relying on other people. You want to rely on other people as little as possible, at least when it comes to something like modding where it's a hobbyist. You don't necessarily know that you can trust the people that you're with. Like, again, I'm in a very special place where the people that I'm currently relying on have been super dedicated and super reliable. And that's part of the reason why I'm even relying on them at all, because I've had so many other experiences where the opposite has happened. And projects that I've worked on with people have just fallen through completely because the other person ghosted for a while or just decided they were done working on Brood War stuff for X amount of months or years or forever. There's any number of reasons why that would end up happening, and it just might be a personality conflict. It might just be that they lose interest in the project. It might be you losing interest in the project, but either way, like I've had a lot of bad experiences with that stuff, so that's why I think it's remarkable that I'm able to avoid that for now. Up until this point, DF has been incredibly helpful with art and with testing. Connor's been incredibly helpful with testing. iQuere and Nave have been incredibly reliable and incredibly helpful with the programming side of things. Voyager's been really helpful in debugging stuff and even doing some programming for Inconsummate and some other stuff on the side. There's people out there, and I'm sure I'm forgetting some names, and I apologize. It's just very late here, so I'm a little scatterbrained. You could probably already tell that. But, even just like the average viewer who pops into the stream or talks on my Discord server or whatever these guys have been really helpful in helping me crowdsource, basically different perspectives on stuff. And that is something that I am very grateful for. I'm grateful for you guys who have hung around for X amount of months or years or even days, whatever, and contributed to the discussion, because that does really help out me as a developer. It helps me understand what you guys think, and I can now couch my own analysis in your guys' analysis as well. I can use that as like a sort of sounding board and back off, bounce my ideas off of yours and vice versa. And I feel like it makes everybody a little bit wiser, a little bit more understanding of what other people think. And you might not agree with what something I say or something a commenter says or whatever, but at least you have that information now. You can understand that a real human being thinks that way, unless they're just fucking trolling you, in which case, sorry, you went into the StarEdit.net shoutbox. I apologize. But aside from that, there's some good to be had there, I think, with the discussion. It has been positive. So aside from just that little tangent, I think that it's important to comment on the fact that you, as a developer, have some resources that you can rely on. If you can rely on people, then that's great. And maybe that's okay to have that overhead, as long as you're not making those your main active projects. Because again, even if those people are reliable, you don't know what the end implementation of those systems that you're asking for or those features you're requesting are going to be like. You might have to mention something you might have to change some dialogue lines. You might have to change some AI or some level design or whatever, some component of your production that you made. might have to end up being reproduced, remade from in some way, modified in some way to suit whatever this third party element was. And so maybe that's a point where you say, I really care about this project. I'm really passionate about it. I really want to make it. All things that are true for Nemesis Omega and Project Hydra. But I'm going to hold off on working on them heavily right now because of this overhead issue. And so I hope that this by design episode has been sort of illuminating in that respect. And it's something that I don't think I've really seen anybody talk about before. Like, I've seen the odd message or mention of team projects and how they're invariably kind of silly. Sometimes, people come in and then they drop out and then they lose interest and they regain interest. People are fickle, or people have, different priorities. And of course, that's always going to be the case. And you can't rely on everybody to really help you out for a long period of time, especially over, when you're talking about working on the same project for years on and off. That's going to be a situation where you probably can only rely on yourself. And so that I've heard people mention that, but I haven't really heard people mention the other kinds of overhead that we've talked about, or even the team-oriented or partner-oriented overhead that I talked about as that second example for stuff like Hydra and Nemesis. I haven't really heard people talk about that in the same detail. So again, I hope that this has been helpful and illuminating, despite the fact that I probably sound like I'm drunk because I'm really tired. But I wanted to get this one out there for you guys to close out the first month of January, and to give you guys a big old smooch and to say 2019 is going to be a good year, even if I start about 50 more projects and decide that they all have overhead and I don't get anything done. I don't think that will happen, but it's already been a pretty good year just with the first month. So I hope you guys are having a good one, and I hope that maybe this educated you in some way and it made you think a little bit more about what you're doing with your own hobbies. If you're trying to make projects like what I'm doing, even remotely similar at all, that can be compared in any way, maybe it helped you out there. And if not, maybe you just enjoyed me stuttering and making jokes. And, if that's your kind of humor, thanks for watching a 22-minute video of me doing that, because that's basically all I did. Bye.